Hello and welcome back to Hydroponics Daily, your go-to podcast for everything soilless cultivation. This week I was talking to somebody about acorns and they said, "Can you eat acorns?" And I said, they were German. And I said, well, actually, during the First World War, German soldiers used to eat acorns and it was a type of ersatz coffee because they couldn't get coffee because naval blockades. It got me thinking about other types of compounds that are poisonous to humans, but we still eat them. And because acorns are mildly toxic, but you can eat them. You're not going to die from them, but they are mildly toxic. And there are lots of plants like this that you're not going to die from, but are mildly toxic, like uncooked potatoes. They've got enzyme inhibitors in them that will block you absorbing protein and things like this. But one of the most interesting is cyanide. And people are often shocked when they're told that food contains cyanide, because we think of it as this poison. You know, it's very much in the Agatha Christie arsenal of poisons that people can consume, along with arsenic and things like this. And so just talk about natural sources of cyanide. Now, unlike arsenic, which is an element, cyanide is an organic compound, which means it contains carbon and nitrogen. It's a very simple compound on the face of it, just a carbon and a nitrogen. And a hydrogen gives you hydrogen cyanide. But when plants contain it, they're contained into something called cyanogenic glycosides. And that means it's just cyanide linked to a sugar molecule or a glucose molecule. Cyanogenic glycosides, a very fancy way of saying that. And it exists in the plant, and it doesn't disrupt the cells that it's in because it's kept away from the enzymes that release hydrogen cyanide. So the cyanogenic glycoside will be in the vacuole of the cell, so the big balloon in the middle of the cell that keeps it turgid, and then the enzymes will be in the cytoplasm, the things where the metabolism occurs. Now, if you break the cells up, you eat a plant that contains these cyanide-containing compounds, and then it will be, the enzymes will mix with the cyanogenic glycosides and release hydrogen cyanide, giving off a distinctive smell. And that distinctive smell is what you would associate with almonds. And so the smell of almonds so if you smell almonds, that's a warning sign that there is cyanide around. And the same but cyanide is in lots of different plants that you may not consider. And many of these might come across in hydroponics. So I thought I'd talk about it. So the first one being bitter almonds, obviously. And I've talked to a lot of plant breeders over the time, and a lot of them consider almond breeding to be one of the worst jobs you can have, because you consume a lot of almonds trying to find the best almond and breed the best almond, because they contain such high levels of cyanide. Now, almond is in the rose family, and so any of the seeds in the rose family will contain a small amount of cyanide. That includes apples, cherries, plums, and things like this. My son ate a load of plum seeds because he's an absolute idiot, and I said to my wife, I better take him to hospital to get him checked out. And they're like, "Oh, they're not blocking his pipes or anything like that." I'm like, "I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about the cyanide." None of the doctors knew about it or anything like that, so it couldn't have been that big an issue. He was fine. There's lots of other plants outside of the rose family that contain cyanide as well. So cassava is a great example. That is a staple root vegetable. Lots of the world's population live on cassava in Africa and South America. It's a root vegetable, really easy to grow, resistant to a lot of pests and diseases, but the bitter varieties contain cyanide, and so you have to cook them and you have to leach the cyanide out. Lima beans in the bean family, they contain cyanide. Sorghum contains hydrogen cyanide as well, and so that's one of the big areas of plant breeding in North America, is to breed various different low cyanide variations. And lastly, bamboo shoots. And we think of bamboo shoots as being this, nondescript thing that you can eat in Chinese food, and pandas eat it, but also contains a large amount of cyanide, or a significant amount. So we said that you can soak or leach out the cyanide. That's one option, and that's commonly done in cassava as well as boiling it. That's why you boil bamboo shoots as well, and lima beans. And then there's other ways like drying and fermentation. Traditional methods for making gari, fermented cassava, is called gari, and that removes hydrogen cyanide. I've never tried gari. Has anyone ever eaten some gari? If you have, then let me know. Be interested. Can you make hydroponic gari? Let's have a look, see if anyone's growing hydroponic cassava. Turns out people have done it, and it's mainly for young seedlings. It's a really good method of getting young seedlings ready for planting out in the field. Interestingly, gari, I have seen gari before, because there's this Instagram, and it's West African cuisine. They live in Italy, and they make like boiled sheep's head, and then they have this like big sloppy mess that goes with it. They eat with it with their hands, and I think that is gari. I always send these videos to my colleagues Josie and Matthew, because Josie is Italian and these are Italian. And I was like, oh, it's authentic Italian food. She screams, this is not Italian food. Yeah, this bright orange, like gelatinous material. And I always wondered what it was. And it turns out that's gari, fermented cassava to remove hydrogen cyanide. Who knew? I'm going to go and try some. I'm going to go get some gari from a local world food shop and try it just for the podcast. We've said that it's anything in the rose family contains cyanide. Cherry laurel, where you have to be really careful when you're pruning cherry laurels in your garden or anywhere else, because when the leaves are crushed, they release massive levels of cyanide. Now, this is not an edible plant, cherry laurel, and you can be overcome with these fumes, especially if you put it in the back of a van or a truck and then drove off. You could get very high levels of cyanide. If you think that's not true, then get a leaf of cyanide and a leaf of cherry laurel, crush it up, put it under a glass, and put any insect in there with it, and the insect will die from cyanide poisoning. It's that toxic. And that's what it's there for. It's there to prevent herbivory. It's anti-herbivory compound, and it's a very powerful gaseous one, not a liquid. I said apple seeds. There's a theory that a cup of apple seeds is enough to kill a human. I read once that a scientist had a bet. Two scientists had a bet, and one of them said you couldn't die from cyanide poisoning from a cup of apple seeds. The other one said you could, and then one of them ate it, and he died. I can't find reference to that, so that might be apocryphal, a false story that's just funny and interesting. And there's obviously the story of Alan Turing, the famous computer scientist who apparently ate an apple laced with cyanide as suicide, and that's where Apple gets its logo from, the computer brand. However, whether that's true or not is very, very much up for debate. And also Oppenheimer, the story that Oppenheimer tried to poison one of his university lecturers with a cyanide-laced apple is also very much debatable, but it is in the film Oppenheimer. This is not the natural levels of cyanide, obviously, in an apple, but these are additional levels added to it. So cyanide, it's one of these infamous chemicals that we think of as being a poison, but it's also natural, probably has some good effects in very small amounts on your gut flora and things like this, but very, very small amounts. Cyanide was used for a time as a sort of soil fumigant, plant fumigant, but it's never used nowadays. There's always better alternatives because of its effects on human metabolism and plant metabolism. It's not something you should use. There's far better alternatives for soil and grow media sterilization, such as ozone, steam, lime sulfur, even hydrogen peroxide's better, really. So don't use cyanide for that. But certainly one you should consider, especially if you're growing plants in the rose family and you're cutting up, like if you imagine you were growing hydroponic cherry laurels and you were pruning them every day in your grow room, you might get exposed to large levels of cyanide potentially. It's something to look out for, especially if you're growing plants in the rose family or cassava or bamboo. Okay, well, sorghum. I've grown sorghum the last couple of years. I tried to grow a frost-tolerant variety of sorghum from North America. It didn't go very well. They all died off due to frost, so they can't be that frost-tolerant, unfortunately. Sorghum's an interesting one because it's also a C4 plant. Not sure if I've talked about C4 plants on the podcast. If I have, then fantastic. If I haven't, I'll probably do an episode on it tomorrow because it's really interesting. Okay. Just check my notes, and it looks like I haven't recorded a podcast about C4 plants. So I'll do that tomorrow because that's really interesting. And you grow these plants slightly differently to most types of plants, what we call C3 plants. So I'll give you a full in-depth episode about C4 plants and how you supercharge their growth in hydroponics. Plants like sorghum and maize, these are all C4 plants. Okay. Thank you very much for listening. Until tomorrow, goodbye.